Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to actually see people attended this session. It's so late in the day, so early before the day, and in comparison to some of the other speakers, I'm glad you actually made it to my session. So just to be sure that you're in the right session, this is Introduction to Windows Azure AppFabric Composite Applications. Nice long title, but the actual subject matter is relatively straightforward. I'm Lewis Bench. I have a nice fancy name called Creative Technologist for a digital agency called TBWA Tequila. And if you want to bash me on Twitter, that's my Twitter handle. My voice might sound a bit croaky to you today. I've been speaking here since 8 a.m. on Connect, so I get to play with a few different technologies, and today I'll be talking to you about Azure as well. So specifically, this is what I'm going to talk to you about. What is the composite app in Azure? And this hopefully will be a surprise to most people, because I even sat down with some of the Azure MVPs today, and they had no idea this actually existed in Azure. I'll talk you through an end-to-end demo and a deep dive. I'll actually show you exactly what it is, how the runtime works, how the management works. We'll look at some custom components, we'll summarize, and then we can ignore roadmap. I won't be doing roadmap, that's not for me to talk about, but we'll do Q&A afterwards. I have to put a disclaimer on this presentation. This presentation is based on the June 2011 CTP of Windows Azure AppFabric. All the demonstrations are done in AppFabric labs. None of this is in production at the moment, and as it's a CTP, it is likely to change progressively as the product group actually enhance this programming model. So just out of curiosity, who actually does Azure development at the moment? Okay, so good, some people. Who's played with Azure? More people play with Azure? Okay, good. So the concepts here I'm going to talk to you about will be familiar. So if you played with Azure, you're working with Azure, you've seen Azure, you've been to an Azure presentation, you'll see at the moment it's a disparate load of services. So we have web services, we have some caching, workflows, access control, some other bits and pieces. They're very unique, and Microsoft refers to them as islands of capability. They're highly productive services, but they're not connected in any way. All of them are relatively complex to deploy to various operating systems, especially if you're deving internally and you're trying to deploy to a stage environment, a production environment. They all have their own config and scaling options. They all have a different management API, especially with Azure. You're in and out of the portals all the time, different parts of the portal to manage different apps, different configuration options. And they all have their own APIs and tools within Visual Studio to actually manage them. So as the Azure app and AppFabric specifically is developing its program model, they wanted to actually try and simplify this process. So first of all, what they've done is they said, hey, instead of having a different program model for different APIs, let's put a single program model and a single tool and support in place. Then we're actually going to take away all these disparate instances of different services, and we want to build a single application. And instead of having to go in and spin up different versions of access control, different versions of service bus, depending on what you're doing, let's just have this single instance that's actually connected together very intuitively. We'll also make management easier. Why do I need to log into separate parts of the Azure portal and manage different parts of Azure? Why can't I just have a single management API? And again, you'll see the pattern here. We're going to consolidate deployment and scalability and make sure that we can have a consistent message as soon as we're pushing apps to the cloud. We're not having to jump around. We're not having to reconfigure. It will just work. So to do this, they developed the AppFabric composition model. They're calling it the new middle tier. So essentially what they're doing is unification. So they're taking away this, they're building this programming model, and they're allowing it to work across the whole .NET stack. They're extending what we know in Visual Studio, what we know in .NET, on the web tier, the middle tier, and the database tier. Then the deployment, they're pushing to the AppFabric management portal. They're going to remove all of the underlying needs to manage scalability and manage deployment up into AppFabric and put it into a single instance called a container. They're going to remove all these disparate connections and actually make them components. So instead of you going in and saying, I will provision this database, I'll provision service bus, or provision access control, these now become components of an application. It all may sound a little bit alien at the moment, but it makes sense when I jump into a demo in a sec. So composite app concepts, we're all building composite applications nowadays. We've been building them for a long time. Most of these would be end-tier style applications in line of business or in websites. We normally break up the modules into this type of structure. So we would have a ASP.NET front end, we'd have our business logic exposed possibly via a WCF service that then ties into some workflow, and we have a persistence layer at the back that in this instance is SQL Azure. When we look at composite apps with, specifically to Azure, we also have a few extra components we need to consider. So beyond the standard .NET, we also have blob storage, table storage, queue services, cache services. All of these need to be managed, they need to be provisioned, and we need to simplify that somehow. So I want to show you how the AppFabric team are simplifying this process, tying it all in, and making it a lot easier for you. The easiest way for me to do this is going to be a demo. So I'll switch across to my machine. My machine's gone to sleep. There we go. Okay, so we're all familiar with Visual Studio. So in this instance, I'm going to create a new application. So what I've actually done is I've gone on to the MSDN and I've downloaded the CTP for AppFabric June 2011. And inside my Visual Studio projects, I actually have some new options, which are AppFabric. And you'll see here that I've got a few different project templates. I've got the AppFabric application, which is the one I'm going to open. I have a Silverlight application, ASP.NET with cache, and business application with orchestration. The three bottom ones are more advanced versions of the top ones with a standard template that comes out the box. So at the moment, I just want a bare bones AppFabric composition application, which I'm going to open up. So what this is actually going to do is going to create me an AppFabric container, which is simply a nice little XAML tile, which doesn't make a lot of sense to anyone. And then we're going to jump into Solution Explorer. And as per normal, I'm going to add a new WCF service. What you'll see has happened is, because this is all around simplifying deployment, as soon as I add this WCF service in, it automatically appears on this application container as a WCF service. We've extended Visual Studio to make Azure more aware of things that are going on within Visual Studio. So it knows that I have a service in there, and it knows that service specifically has an endpoint. So it exposes that to me. So also what I want to do is add a web application. I want to make an end-tier style construct here. So I'll go in and add a new project. I'll add an ASP.NET web application. So again, two projects represented on the screen. Pretty standard stuff. However, if I was now to deploy this into Azure, I wouldn't know any of the address information in regards to my WCF service. It could get provisioned on a server in a data center anywhere in the world, and I would need to go in and manually reconfigure my access points, change configuration files, and bits and pieces like that. This makes deployment really, really complicated. Especially if I'm auto-provisioning, auto-scaling. If my WCF service is going through some type of load balancer, or my ASP.NET is going through some type of load balancer, how do I configure this type of interaction? It all requires manual configuration. But to solve this, what we actually do is within this AppFabric composite application, we can actually create a service reference very similar to how we was doing it before. And we can go into the services. Sorry, wrong one. Go into the ASP.NET application. We can go into service 1, and we can add an endpoint to a service. Okay, I have to build first. So essentially what this is doing is very similar to add service reference that we would have had an SVC util in Visual Studio. But what you'll actually notice is that we have no metadata that's actually been referenced. What we actually have in the web config as well, we have no WCF information. What this is actually doing is abstracting away all this connection information and putting it in this little service references class here, which is actually empty at the moment because it hasn't recompiled. But it actually abstracts all that away into an address service for us. So when we actually go to deploy this to DevFabric or to Azure AppFabric, it will actually manage the configuration and type all the metadata. So what I want to do, just to demo this working, is I want to make sure this service is running. So standard hello world WCF service. I want to put a piece of data in here. So I want to put a input box. And a button. So ignore my code and standards here. I'm trying to do this quickly rather than to best practice. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm wiring up this method and I want to actually pull into that service I've just provisioned. Which isn't working. Okay, so that's going to give me the first issue of the day. So what this actually allows us to do as well is it removes all the deployment nightmares of Azure in terms of load balancing and scale as well. So instead of having to go into the Azure application that we previously would have had when we was building the Azure application and trying to go into the project properties and tell it how many instances we wanted to spin up and change all the configuration, all the persistence information, all the keys and stuff like that, it's actually been extremely simplified. So I can jump into this ASP.NET application now. My Visual Studio responds. Change to this deployment view. And if you actually have a look in the properties, you'll actually see that we can actually define that if we want to increase the scale of this application, we can say, let's change it to 3 instances of the web layer. And then for the AppFabric container, we'll scale up to 2. These properties are actually, as part of the CCP, are being increased. So they're most probably going to, in the final version, start to see things like auto-scale as well. So with the monitoring API that I'll show you later, they can actually start to track how much of that application has been used and automatically scale out the instances if needs be. And you can toggle all that through this application. So what will happen now is if I actually control F5 this application, it'll spin up an instance of the DevFabric, and it'll actually scale if it would build. And what I do is I'll actually go along and spin up the instance of the DevFabric, and then it will compile my applications, deploy to the DevFabric as a normal Azure application, but also scale out all the instances as I asked for. So we should see 2 instances of a WCF service and 3 instances of as a web role. So if I open up the DevFabric emulator, so you'll see it's spun up my container. So what this is doing is underneath it's bringing up the deployment package, which is a cab file that underneath with all the assemblies in and the manifest files. It's then going to do some address resolution. So it's going to assign each service its own address. It's then going to update all the configuration in each project and deploy, hopefully. And my computer's frozen. There we go. So it's now deployed to DevFabric. This is the container underneath. And I should now be able to log into that service through a browser and see the WSDL file. Because it's just a basic HTTP service, It should have loaded up. Okay, I'll jump to here's one I made earlier. So this is actually a lot more important than just a two-tier application. When we actually look at complete end-tier structures like an e-commerce application, it becomes a lot more clear as to why we need things like this. So this is a sample application in regards to pizza ordering website. So same construct as before. We have an ASP.NET website. We have a service, and then behind the service, we have loads of workflows, which via service bus actually interact with one another. So what we've done here is we've gone through, we've added the website in its own container, in its own module. What this allows us to say is that website is sandboxed and has its own scale-out features. So if we want to scale out the web tier but not the service tier, we can allow it with its own properties. We've then grouped up all of the AppFabric services. The reason we've done this is because they're stateless services. Again, the same principle. We've bundled them together because if we want to scale one, we want to scale all of them. Down the bottom here as well, you'll see that I've got a SQL Azure database. So when I spin this up, what I essentially want to do is be able to say, if I spin up an instance of this pizza site, once it hits the AppFabric layer in to spin up an Azure instance as well as all the service bus instances as well. Because we've actually managed the service references through the AppFabric composition API as opposed to going in and using service util or the add service reference functionality in Visual Studio, we can actually see the relationship that I've shown you in this diagram here. And this is really important because when we actually go and provision this into Azure, the relationship makes sure, the relationship between the applications that Azure is aware of makes sure that the servers that it's and the roles it's provisioning underneath are actually in the same proximity. So they're in the same virtual data center. They have minimal latency. The correct interfaces are going to sit between them. If we ever break one of these dependencies, then it could be that we're going to see negative performance impacts on the application when we deploy it. So again, all of this is exactly the same as it was before. I can go in and toggle different properties prior to deployment. If I hit Control F5, this one hopefully should deploy, and it'll actually go off and build that application. You can ask now.
Where do you mention the URL for the cloud services? The actual endpoint, where will be hosted?
So at the moment, they're pure AppFabric, so they're not spinning up anywhere. I'll show you deployment in a sec, and that's where that will come into it. Okay. As AppFabric extends as well, I mentioned before there's some standard Azure capabilities that we may want to include in this application. So if I actually go into Design View again, and go to this Add Reference Services, you'll see out of the box that we've got all the standard Azure functionality, blob, table, cation. If we want to add any of this to our application, it's just simply a matter of going Add Reference Service, add it in. So for instance, I can say I want to add cation in. Click OK. If I click cation, you then see all the standard Azure properties that you'd need, things like access tokens, all the host name, the port numbers, and bits and pieces like that. I can then go into my web API. I can then add a service reference, and then I can jump down to reference services and add cation in. That's as simple as it is to add these Azure and AppFabric capabilities into your applications. What will happen then, like I say, if I go to deploy it, it'll automatically spin all this up in the background for me. What you'll also notice is down the bottom here, there's one called Yahoo Finance as well. It's obviously not an Azure application. It's not a standard component. That's one I've added in myself for demo purposes. This is actually an extensible API. So if you're an ISV or you're a service provider and you want to start value-adding customers that build Azure applications, you can actually extend this yourself. So there's no reason why people like PayPal couldn't encompass their API into one of these components and actually have the account provisioned as part of this process. So as soon as you go and deploy into AppFabric, it'll also hit your API and start provisioning accounts. And I'll actually talk through how to create these components later in the presentation. So So my dev fabric has finally deployed, and you'll actually see I have my web role here with 3 instances as per any normal application. So let me just talk you through exactly what's going on under the hood, and then I'll talk you through the management portal. So let's switch back to PowerPoint. So the idea of this authoring, just to sum up what I'm showing you here, is we want to simplify how we build Azure applications. We want it to be very much a drag and drop instance of developing applications. We don't want you to have to go off, download a template, add a new project, have that template with its own properties, go into portals to provision different things. It should be very, very simple and very intuitive to do. At the same time, it needs to be very familiar to how you're used to working with Visual Studio. The standard features like add service reference, that we're trying to take how you would normally add an external web service and bring that into the interface as well. The programming model is exactly the same. So to actually reference external services is exactly the same as the add service reference and the SVC util for external web services. It will generate all your proxies. It will give you a strongly typed API with full IntelliSense as well. And throughout every single service that is in this composition model, it's a uniform way of actually working. So everything will just work intuitively. You'll add a new API and you'll immediately work out how to use it. When I actually hit Control F5, there's a lot going on under the hood to actually tie all this together. You have this concept of a container, which was that nice little XAML diagram that you saw there. Underneath that is consisting of all of this functionality. So first of all, it actually manages the placement. So what we need to assess is where all these services are going to sit. So making sure they're in the close proximity, the low latency, and they're going to be able to communicate to one another. It's also going to manage the lifecycle. So what it'll actually do is when you actually go to deploy, it will go through a pre-deployment process. It'll make sure everything compiles. It'll make sure everything's successful when it hits Azure. It'll then go to an actual provisioning process. It'll go through, make sure that in sequence your SQL's up and running before your caching, before your service bus. It'll then also manage your scale out as well. So if you're going to say, I want to scale out at certain points, it'll actually go and automatically provision new instances and make sure that high availability works. And if you need to scale out to different services, that things like load balances and persistence and session caching is all going to work, and we're not going to have issues there. As this is a multi-tenant system as well, it actually works with only going to be one container for the whole entire AppFabric. It manages the isolation of your application, manages the provisioning of resources, the routing between different address provisioning services, and also usage monitoring and error logs as well. So as per all Azure APIs, they're completely REST-based. So the provisioning process I'm about to talk you through is all going to be through an Azure portal. However, underneath, that's a REST API, and there's a full PowerShell library as well. So again, if you're an ISV or you're a software as a service provider that is currently deploying into Azure, you can actually take this and bring it into your own custom provisioning library, which could be your own custom web UI if you wanted to. So the deployment process itself is we take a package, the output of the Visual Studio project, very similar to web deploy. If you've been to a web deploy session, it's a zip file with all the manifests and the DLLs and assemblies. That gets uploaded to the system. It then gets persisted into the AppFabric config store. So it's literally ghosted in, very similar to how SharePoint works. It's in a SQL database as a binary object. When we say we want to deploy it, it'll actually pull this back out of the database, extract everything it needs, all the configuration settings in all the assemblies, and verify all of that. It will then provision the application, so it'll know that it needs X amount of web roles, X amount of service bus instances and access control, and it will go out and do that for us. There we go, it's going out to provision all these bits and pieces. It then configures runtime settings. So once we have all our instances connected, we need to maybe go back and change configuration settings to make sure they all tie together properly. So it'll do all that for us once we've actually defined what them runtime settings are. Last of all, it actually starts to monitor our application. So to make it easier to look at things like ASP.NET page latency, or to look at error logs and bits and pieces like that from an Azure application, this all gets aggregated up and puts into a a table storage application, which again is accessible via the REST API, but will also spit out familiar service tracing logs. So it makes the whole diagnostic and instrumentation of the application a lot easier. So what I'll do is I'll get in now and I'll show you exactly how the deployment of this application works. So I'll switch back to my demo machine. Okay, so this is back to my, not my stock tipper, because that didn't work. Oh, my stock tipper does work. So there's two ways of deploying. I can actually bundle up this application. So I have this nice little composite app here, which is a couple of different services. I've got my Yahoo Finance bespoke component, which is actually going out and making REST call to Yahoo Finance for me. I have a website, and I have a service that sits in the middle. If I want to deploy this up to Azure, I've actually defined in my deployment properties. So I'm going to have one instance of that container, 3 instances of that container. I've set my trace log levels to verbose, so it's going to output a lot of information for me. And I've defined some custom properties in here for Yahoo. So I've defined the Yahoo URI and bits and pieces like that. These are runtime properties that can be changed at runtime if needs be. What I've also done in the Solution Explorer is I can hit publish. This is a very familiar API if you've used Web Deploy or if you've deployed any projects from Visual Studio, but it's actually a customized interface. So what this is looking for now is my AppFabric authentication details. So if you want to use this CTP, you actually have to go into AppFabric Labs, which looks a bit like this. So familiar AppFabric interface. In AppFabric Labs, you'll see access control, service bus, cache, standard AppFabric components. At the bottom, there's a new one, which is applications, which is what we're working on at the moment. Inside applications, you'll see your actual namespace, exactly the same as service bus and access control. And you'll see that we've had some bits provisioned for me. These are all the container management storage areas. So this is for actually storing all my metadata and my log files. And the most important bit I need here is my manager API, my manager key, and my endpoints, which are all detailed along the side here. If you want to access this as part of the CTP, what you do need to do is actually apply to the AppFabric team, because when you're provisioning applications within this, all the Azure instances that are being spun up are being billed internally to the AppFabric team. It's not actually coming out of your Azure allowance. So there's only actually a limited amount of availability for this, but they are opening it up more and more. So they're developing the CTP. So I've got all this information, and I've put it into Visual Studio. If I then hit publish, I'm not going to publish that one, but I am going to publish the pizza one. Azure at the moment seems to be having gremlins internally in TechEd, so every presentation I've heard of has not worked properly, so don't expect this to. So same details, hit publish. What you actually see is along the bottom here, it's going through the standard Visual Studio compilation. Once it's actually compiled, you'll start to see it publishing. And what it's actually doing is it's going to push over HTTP, this big bundle of assemblies and manifest files up to the REST service. The latency on this is phenomenal. It takes about 45 minutes to send a 2 meg file to the US from here. So I've already done it. You can actually manually upload this as well. So instead of, if you're in an environment where you have stringent controls and your IT pros actually manage to use your instance and developers are hands-off, you can bundle this up and hand it to an IT pro who can log into the management labs and just upload the CAB file. So from here, I jump to my management URI, which is this one here, and it looks something like this. So it's, again, a familiar Azure Silverlight dashboard. And what you'll actually see is my stock ticker app is started down here, and my pizza app, which was the one I just hit deploy on, is partially deployed but failed. So this is the management dashboard. This is the underlying crux of why we're actually using this composition model. It's an aggregation of all the config files, the diagnostics, the monitoring, the provisioning. So the important parts to note here is you can actually have multiple applications, and you can actually dive into each of them. So I look into my stock ticker app, and you'll actually see here, I have all the information I just had within Visual Studio. I have full access to it, and I can actually jump in, and if I need to, I can start changing bits around. So I can jump into my configuration of my containers, and I can jump right deep in. And within here, I can start playing around with config settings, which are equivalent to the web.config settings within something like WCF. At the application level as well, I can also manage scale. So if I've provisioned my application and I've decided that it's meeting capacity and I want to start to scale out, I can just jump into the scale tab, hit the scale out count, and tell it how many more instances I want to spin up. This is all done without the application recycling. So it encourages your SLAs to stay up, and it will just allow you to continue working on the application. What I can also do is manage things like SSL certificates, but more importantly, application logs. If my application starts to throw errors and need to see real-time event logs, I can jump into here, and I can jump into the admin log as well. Exactly the same information as you expect to find in the event log on Windows. So here, this is just my verbose information from my outputs. The application log, I can jump in, and I should actually see more detailed information. I can also jump in a more granular level. So if I want to see specifically the ASP.NET application, I can go in and look at more information. So if I hit monitoring, when the page refreshes, you should actually start to see instrumentation diagnostics such as page latency and load times and all this bits and pieces that you'd like to see from your application. All this is doing is piping standard diagnostics and tracing from your application into a more visible manner on AppFabric. So if you're actually building bespoke components and APIs, you can just use the standard diagnostic sources you'd find in the .NET framework, and all of this comes for free once you actually deploy up there. So you don't need to actually customize any of the diagnostics tracing. For some reason, the logs aren't loading up. Okay, jump back into PowerPoint. Oops, wrong screen. So when we look to manage Composite applications, we are trying to manage the end-to-end process in the most simple manner possible. So this is, we want to be able to create this Visual Studio manifest up. We want to say exactly how many instances we want to scale out, put all our information into the project, hit deploy, it goes up, and Azure does the rest for us. We don't want to have to be jumbling around all these portals to manage it. And that's what we really want to do through this management portal. It's a single place of reference to go for diagnostics data, monitoring data, provisioning, reconfiguring, and rescaling. Because all of this is actually done on the Azure side, it can actually be done without recycling your application. So if we want to spin up more instances, it increases our SLAs, guarantees performance, and also takes into account things like I say before, like load balancers and bits and pieces that may be put in front of our application that we're unaware of when we're developing. The other part of the demo I want to show you is the custom components, because the extensibility of the API is really important for its success. It's more than just the Azure team saying, here's a bunch of things that we create, it's great, use it. It's actually more about people being able to extend the components as service providers, allowing some value add. So what I want to do is actually open up my Yahoo component and actually show you exactly what's going on under the hood. So I'll switch back over to demo. Okay, so the components themselves are Visual Studio extensions. So to actually build these out, I'm not sure why this is playing up. To build these out, you need the Visual Studio SDK installed. And what we're actually using here is simply a Visual Studio extension project. And it's a standard MEF extension, so it's an extensibility framework based on some APIs built by the AppFabric team. So what you'll notice here is there's a lot of manifest and metadata and bits and pieces, and this is all part of the Visual Studio template. So when you go file new Visual Studio package, it gives you all this for free. The only bits I've added in are the bits that say Yahoo on them. So the Yahoo Finance namespace and the Yahoo Finance component package here. So what we actually have to do is, first of all, have some logic in there. So this could be your existing API references and assembly, or it could be you bringing all your classes into the package themselves. So in my instance, I have just a very basic go out to make a web request, bring back a CSV, pass the CSV, return it as a strongly typed object. To expose this, I need a few pieces of information. So what I actually do is I go out and I say, for me to know how to provision this service, I need specifically a URI. I need to know where to point my service to. So I actually inherit from this service export definition here, which is a base class within the AppFabric library, and say, this is my export definition. This is the properties that I need for this export to work. Export being one of their names for their components. I then go in and create the export itself. So essentially, I'm not doing anything here apart from returning the logic. So I'm saying, I need a URI. I can construct a URI, the Yahoo Finance service here, and then I return the service. So I'm just returning an instance of my service. So that could be a web service, an API. What that will do is, through the powers of reflection, when it actually hits a composite application, it'll allow me to then see all my internal methods and start calling them. The last piece of information I need are actually the information that the application needs itself to actually start provisioning. And these are basic things like description, type names, a list of assemblies that I'm calling in, and the pretty things like icons and bits and pieces like that. That's as much logic as going into extending these applications besides actually writing your APIs. So I can compile that, and it'll actually output a Visual Studio extension, which looks something like this. So you'll be familiar with these if you've used Visual Studio Gallery or Visual Studio extensions. You'll start to see some of these hit the Visual Studio Gallery as more and more people start to build these out. When they're installed, you go to Extension Manager, and you'll actually see my Yahoo Finance component down there. So you'll actually, if you're in a ISV, you'll start deploying these, and then you can do things like through Visual Studio Gallery, do automatically updates and bits and pieces like that. Once I'm in my application, so I jump back to my stock tip application, I can go into add reference services, and any of the components that I've built or anyone else has built will be in here. I can then jump into my stock ticker and actually start referencing these. So if I go into my stock ticker service, have I referenced here? So I've referenced my Yahoo service. You'll notice within my stock ticker service, there is no app.configs. There's only this service reference class. You'll see through the reflection, it's actually going out, calling that assembly and bringing in the methods. And within my logic, I can actually, I think I might have already done it here. So you'll actually see that I'm creating a service reference to create input one. That's the common name that it's given itself. I can actually clean that up if I wanted to, but it's called import one here. And then from there, I actually see everything on my Yahoo service, which is a single method called getStockQuotes. From there, it will go out and call it. What happens is when this provisions, if this is anything else but simple CSV parser, it would actually handle all the provisioning as well. So I can actually inherit from an interface that AppFabric give me called provisioning deployment, and that just basically means that you have to put a few more methods in there, but once you go through that deployment process, you can start calling your own APIs for the purposes of provisioning. So again, going back to, say, an instance of Bing Maps would be a good example. If I want to start geocoding and I need an API key set up and some other properties set up before I can start using that service, by adding in that provisioning interface, it means once I've hit publish on here, it'll automatically go off, provision everything in terms of these your AppFabric applications, but also hit your API and say, before I can use this application, I need you to do X, Y, and Z, which will then return and then report back to the application to say it's been successful. So that's as simple as it is to actually create the application. So For me, that's all I can really show you. This is simplification of Azure. It's nothing complicated. It's actually bringing the standard composite application model that we're familiar working with and aggregating all them complicated Azure services and making it simple. If I drag this out even longer, it would actually complicate a subject that is meant to be simplifying something that's already complicated. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense. But what I really want to try and explain here is that the reason this is being done is because they feel that at the moment the provisioning and development of Azure applications is too complex. We want to simplify it down, and we want to make it as standardized as possible across the whole stack and bring it back in line with the .NET runtime. So by doing that, we're extending Visual Studio, as you've seen, through that nice little diagram model. We're going to have to drag and drop and link things up. And actually then extend that to all of the AppFabric services we have now and all the AppFabric services that are coming in the future and third-party services that are available. We want to be able to then push that up into Azure and have this scalability functionality without having to worry about it. We want Azure to take care of our scale, to extend it out, to provision roles without us having to be concerned about where they're ending up, and make sure that latency is low and they're in the right data centers and one's not being deployed in Asia Pacific and one's not being deployed in the US, and have that all handled for us. We want it to lower our TCO as well, but we don't want to necessarily have an ops team and an IT team and a dev team all worried about this stuff. We want this to be intuitive. This is the idea of cloud computing, is intuitive composition of applications, and to make it quick and easy. So with that, that's all I can show you, but I do have 20 minutes to answer some questions, so feel free to ask. So over here. The what portal, sorry?
The Azure management portal where you create your current work roles and web roles and game roles.
So the question is this a replacement for the Azure management portal? I can't answer that. I don't work for the Azure team. This is certainly where the AppFabric model is heading. The AppFabric model as well being not just Azure, but the AppFabric against server and cloud. It's more than likely Azure will still be isolated services, because it may be that you want to pull Azure into composite apps that also use things like Amazon and other services. So you're still going to have them isolated management APIs. But this, I think, if you're building all-encompassing Azure applications, will be the way you'll start to provision them.
So I still need to do the provisioning of the work roles in the Azure management portal.
So if you're using this, it will do it all for you. So if you're building a composition application using this API, it will often provision all of that stuff for you, and you don't have to worry about it. If you want to bring that application into something that's not using this model, then certainly you will have to worry about that management API. Yeah.
Question regarding configuration of WCF. I think when Live came out, we got some fantastic abilities to get very light configuration. Faults that they give us are almost always wrong, but we only want to change one or two of those defaults.
Yes.
And then you're in for a dime, in for a dollar. You got to configure everything up. So I'm a little skeptical when I see a config file that has no WCF information, thinking, all right, now I should be array of 10,000 somethings, and now we get 8,000.
So
How do I actually configure? Should I configure at that level of granularity now?
So the WCF configuration I've shown you, and I skipped over because I was actually having an issue with more advanced bindings. So there is actually there's a level of 15, 16 configurations which the AppFabric team have deemed, being the people that write WCF anyway, they've deemed are the most valuable. So it's things like include exception in response and bits like that. And each binding has its own options. They are all configurable in the options prior to deployment, and then once you've actually deployed to the AppFabric management portal, you can actually go in and configure them reconfigure them on the fly if needs be. They are there. It's just unfortunately the demos that I have didn't represent that in its entirety. If you want to get into more granular details, the problem you're going to have is because you're not creating the endpoint essentially there and then, it's being created dynamically for you. is how you actually configure that. And it may be that you have to do that pragmatically within your code and actually say, well, once you spun this up, if this endpoint exists, then change this setting and this setting and this setting. But the guys that write this are the guys that actually write the WCF, and they're the guys, and they're progressively changing it. As you know, WCF changes every instance of .NET, and this is the direction they feel like they should be heading in.
So if I understand it correctly, there's 10 or 15 key configuration points.
Yes.
That they take out of the WCF endpoint configuration, put it into the AppFabric configuration, and use that information to generate all that.
Yes.
Hopefully close configuration.
Yeah, and that's the way WCF's heading anyway. They're trying to, originally WCF, they thought that more was great, and then they've refined it, and now they're refining it even more. This is a CTP, so the reason it's here is for people to provide that feedback. So if you actually want to play with it, you can email the team back again. The team's relatively small, it's only like 15 people, and they do respond to your emails. So say, hey, this option isn't here, I'd really like it here, and you'll most likely see it added in the next revision.
Buffer size and array size, those are problem.
Yeah, and message size, all that type of stuff is all in there. They are the options that they've included. VM role hasn't been included yet. I think that's because you've got a whole new deployment scenario once you've got VM role. It's similar to like Azure Connect as well, because you have to obviously put something on the VM, and to do that, you're going to end up having to put MSIs and PowerShell and bits and pieces like that into the deployment scenario. It will most probably come. I don't think it's the top of their list of priorities at the moment. I can't answer that. The messages I'm getting is the entire of the AppFabric world will eventually come into this, but I would see the deployment story would be a little bit more complicated than the standard N-tier application for that type of thing. Any more questions? My understanding, and again, I can't quote this, I'm not a Microsoft employee, but there is going to be a minimal cost for the composition API, and then everything else just provisions as per your standard subscription. So it's going to go off, use your account details to actually provision web roles and bits and pieces like that. You're not going to be charged any more or any less for that. But what you might have is a slight overhead for the management portal, because it is doing the automatic provision, scale in management, and that storage does cost, so they most probably will charge you for that. If you take them up on the CTP now, though, everything you provision is done courtesy of Microsoft, and you're not paying for any of them apps you provision.
Just a question on multi-tenancy. It seemed like you were showing us an instance where multiple worker roles you were putting into the same servers, and separately web roles on this different set of servers. Does that tendency go to worker roles and web roles?
So what they're actually looking at is not necessarily servers, because what they'll actually do is obviously they set up their own roles, and each role can be in its own VM on its own. It's actually, no, that doesn't change. That's still the same as it would be if you deployed it today. What the modules that we're grouping were for the purposes of scalability. So we was grouping services up to say these are all going to be services that may use some kind of persistence layer or caching layer. So if we scale them, we have to take into consideration X, Y, and Z. And it's just a level of similarity for provisioning purposes. So it could be that all of your modules are unique and they all sit in their own level of isolation, or that you can group some up, and when you scale them out, they can share resources and save you some money in terms of provisioning. So that's purely what that's for. SQL Azure was in there. It was actually my pizza app. So that will actually go through, and it uses database, DAC files, database authoring component, I think that it is. So it'll actually go through, provision you a database, and then use that to actually go out and create the database for you. What I am actually struggling with at the moment was the concept of my workflows using the SQL Azure as persistence, and being able to compile my workflows and then somehow retrieve the connection string and manipulate the connection strings. I know it's possible, I just haven't got my head around how that is actually running. But yeah, SQL Azure as a standard persistence layer does work, and it's there today.
And is the deployment on that through the same RESTful interface, or is it through SQL?
So same interface. So it's actually one of the reference components. So exactly the same as my Yahoo component. You go SQL Azure instance, you pass it some criteria around your account, and then you associate a DAC project to it. And that way, when it gets bundled up, all the SQL gets bundled up with that. It'll go off, deploy it, and then do all the SQL for you at the same time and build that database up.
And it sends that through a REST interface?
Yes.
So you don't have to tell
So the REST interface is the upload of the package. So it's a HTTP interface that just takes this 5-10 megabyte package as a blob and stores it in a database. Once it's there, everything is done internally via Azure API. So it'll pull this out of the database and then goes and execute SQL internally. Yeah, so the integration piece is there, and there's no reason why you can't start playing around with it. You just obviously need the consideration of, if you're doing an automatic deployment, how are you going to manage the credentials of that external application if they're not part of your instance. So it could be that you either write a custom component that does that, or you embed that logic in the configuration, and then you make sure that when you deploy it, you validate all the runtime components, or you just, when you deploy at runtime, you go through and check all the configuration and just make sure that the right URIs and stuff there for the external component. But it does like none of the underlying components have changed, so you can still use service bus for service bus and connecting to external services, so that's what it's there for. I've never tried it, and it would be an interesting question to ask the AppFabric team. I would have thought it's some kind of transaction-based that it will actually roll back the upgrade, which is how, although at the moment the deployment seems to partially fail, so I would say they're not 100% there yet in the process, because when I deployed my pizza app, it's actually gone out and deployed my web instance and my services, but none of the workflows underneath have provisioned. So I've ended up with a half-strung application that doesn't actually do anything, and it never rolled it back. But it would make sense to me that they would put transaction in, but because it's still an early build of this, it hasn't actually made it. Yeah, so you can set up deployment strategies, and this is the reason it's a multi-phase deployment. So you can have, obviously, your staging instances, and then you deploy, and then you actually have a pre-deployment configuration you can go and change. So you can change any variables you need between staging and production, and then you can have a second deployment that will then push out to production. So you can have that multiple stage deployment scenario. And then if you want to automate it or bring it into build servers and stuff like that, the whole thing is exposed via REST and via PowerShell. So you can easily link it up to something like TFS or TeamCity for that automation as well. I'm not 100% sure on upgrades. I've never tried it. I'm just hypothesizing. I couldn't answer it. I'm just assuming that it would be some kind of transaction-based service that they're going to introduce to allow it, but I'm not 100% sure. It's a question I can fire back to the AppFabric team if you would like me to. You can import, so you can create a container up and you can add references to all of existing projects, and it will automatically build up that relationship for you and the container, and you can deploy it. The problem you're going to have is the container, once it's deployed, they're not going to be able to associate itself to existing Azure applications you have deployed. So it may be that you have to go for a transition of redeployment and bringing down older services and spinning up newer instances, which isn't obviously going to be the best scenario, but because it's migrating to a whole new API and that container needs accountability and interaction with them instances, I don't know the best another migration path at the moment. It may be when this hits production that they build a migration tool that will allow you to do that. Any other questions? Okay, that's it from me. So there's a few more winner touch mouse and get rewarded slides, but I think that's it from me. So have a good party and the rest of the conference.